Thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm your host, Daniel Davis. Joining us on the program today is Ken Croswell. He is professor at Harvard University in astronomy, and we're going to be talking today about a planet that most of us know about but probably know very little about. For those of you aspiring to understand astronomy a little better, especially when it comes to our solar system and what our planets are, I think you'll be in for a real treat. The planet is Pluto. Way out there on the fringe. It's the last planet of the solar system, and it's the furthest away from the sun. But there was also a controversy about whether or not Pluto was actually a planet at all. In fact, there was a great debate that was trying to basically strip Pluto of its possibility of being a planet to nothing more than just being a moon. So we're going to let Ken Croswell tell us exactly what Pluto is and find out some amazing things that you probably didn't know before. And I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Ken Croswell. Ken, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Glad to be here, Dan.
You bet. Let's talk about what Pluto is. I know as a kid, I knew that it was the furthest planet away from the sun, and it was also probably the coldest, but what are some other things that people might be interested in knowing about?
Well, this year marks the 80th anniversary of Pluto's discovery. Pluto was discovered on February 18th, 1930, by a young astronomer in Flagstaff, Arizona, Clyde Tombaugh. And as you point out, it's very far away. When we were kids, it was the farthest known planet in the solar system. Its average distance from the sun is 3.7 billion miles. So light, which takes just 8 minutes to reach Earth from the sun, takes several hours to reach Pluto. We now know that Pluto has some moons, too. It's got 3 moons that we know of. The first of those moons was discovered in 1978. That moon is half the diameter of Pluto, goes around Pluto every 6.5 days. And recently, astronomers used the Hubble Space Telescope to discover 2 more moons of Pluto. And they named those moons Nix and Hydra. And those names are not a coincidence. Nix and Hydra are the initials of the New Horizons spacecraft, N and H, the initials of the New Horizons spacecraft, which was launched by NASA in 2006 and will reach Pluto in July of 2015. We don't really know exactly what Pluto looks like because it's so far away. Even with the Hubble Space Telescope, you can take a look at the picture there in 10 worlds, and you can see that it doesn't really show all that much. So this spacecraft, this New Horizons spacecraft, will in 2015 give us our first close-up view of Pluto and its 3 known moons, and also look for new moons.
Now, it's really interesting because it's come to be understood that Pluto is the 10th largest object in our solar system.
That's right. Pluto is the 10th largest object in the solar system. The planets Mercury through Neptune, those 8 planets, are all larger than Pluto. Pluto is the 10th largest object that goes around the sun in our solar system. In 2005, astronomers discovered something far beyond Pluto, 3 times farther than Pluto, going around the sun, and it's slightly bigger than Pluto, and that is the 9th largest object going around the sun. So if you classify Pluto as a planet, then you must also classify this other world, which is now named Eris, E-R-I-S, as a planet as well. And in fact, I devote a full chapter of my book, 10 Worlds, to Eris, because Eris is a very important world too. It's the farthest thing we have ever seen in our solar system. It's 9 billion miles from the sun. That's nearly 100 times farther from the sun than the Earth is.
Now, what's interesting is that this is the only planet so far that spacecraft haven't actually traveled past.
Of the 9 planets that we grew up with, that's true. We have sent spacecraft past all the planets from Mercury to Neptune, but not Pluto. We are now sending the spacecraft to Pluto, but right now we really don't know exactly what Pluto looks like. We know from its density that it's made mostly of rock. 2/3 of its mass is rock, and it's coated with a topping of water ice and methane ice. The ice makes up about 1/3 of Pluto's mass. But that doesn't really tell us the details of the geology or exactly what the surface is going to look like. And so in 2015, we're all going to be watching and learning together what Pluto really looks like. And as you point out, it's the one planet of the 9 that we grew up with that has not been explored by spacecraft yet.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm curious, Ken, why it was that there was such a debate of whether or not Pluto was a planet. I mean, it seemed to be an almost fierce one.
Oh, yes, and it's an ongoing controversy. This controversy has not been resolved. In 2006, a few hundred astronomers voted that Pluto was not a planet anymore, but the following week, a few hundred other astronomers said, hey, we're signing this petition to say we object to that vote, and we're going to keep regarding Pluto as a planet. Here's why the problem has arisen. Pluto was discovered, as I mentioned, in 1930, and it was discovered as a result of a search initiated long ago by Percival Lowell, an astronomer who established the Lowell Observatory in Arizona. Now, Percival Lowell was actually more interested in the planet Mars and in finding a distant planet, but he, in 1905, before Pluto's discoverer was even born, he started looking for a ninth planet in our solar system, and he analyzed the motion of the planet Uranus. He thought that there was a distant planet, a massive planet, that was tugging through its gravity on the planet Uranus, and he tried to locate where that planet was. He tried to calculate where it was, and he searched for it, and unfortunately never found it. He died in 1916. Then Lowell Observatory renewed the search for what Lowell had called Planet X in 1929, hired Clyde Tombaugh, who was a young man from Kansas. Tombaugh devised a search scheme to uncover this distant world, and just not very long after he began the search, Clyde Tombaugh discovered Pluto. He took photographic plates of the sky at night, and then during the day he examined those plates. He looked through all those stars, millions of stars, for a moving object, a faint moving object, and that faint moving object was Pluto. Mm-hmm. And the problem is, even from the very first, the astronomers knew that that planet that they had found was not nearly as big and massive as Percival Lowell had predicted. And their initial guess was maybe it had about the mass of the Earth. And then as the years passed, astronomers realized it was a good deal smaller. In 1950, there was a very important observation made by Gerard Kuiper using the world's largest telescope, in which he estimated that Pluto was about halfway in size between Mercury and Mars. And those are the numbers that a lot of us grew up with concerning Pluto. But then in 1978, when Pluto's first moon was discovered, we realized Pluto was not nearly that big. And in fact, during the 1980s, Pluto and this first moon eclipsed each other. The duration of those eclipses revealed that Pluto is only half the diameter of Mercury. But that's still more than twice the diameter of Ceres, which is the largest asteroid. So at that point, Pluto was sort of in limbo. I mean, do you consider it a planet or do you consider it an asteroid? It didn't really fit terribly well into either class. And then, starting in 1992, astronomers started to discover lots of other things in the outermost solar system. Most of these things are much, much smaller than Pluto, but it means that Pluto belongs to a belt of objects, first proposed by an Irish astronomer, Kenneth Edgeworth, in 1943, and then later by Gerard Kuiper in 1951. And this Edgeworth-Kuiper belt, we now know, contains more than 1,000 known objects. Now, most of them are much, much smaller than Pluto, but it does mean that Pluto is part of a belt of objects, and to some astronomers, that's a no-no for a proper planet. A proper planet should be pretty much alone in its orbit around the sun. So where we stand today is that some astronomers classify Pluto as a planet. I'm with them. I think Pluto should remain classified as a planet, as it has been since 1930. And then other astronomers don't want to classify it as a planet. They think it's too small, too unimportant, that it belongs to this belt of objects, and it crosses the orbit of Neptune. So all of those things they don't like about Pluto. But as I mentioned a few minutes ago, Pluto is the 10th largest object that orbits the sun. So it's not really as small as some people seem to think.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm curious, because there was this debate, what constitutes, according to astronomers, the makeup of what is a planet?
Well, that depends on the astronomer you ask, okay?
Okay.
Let me first give you my definition of planet, because my definition of planet is actually simpler than anyone else's I've ever heard. My definition of a planet of the sun is simply an object that's going around the sun that's the size of Pluto or bigger. That's a definition very similar to our definition of a hurricane. We define a hurricane as a tropical storm whose wind velocity exceeds 74 miles per hour. That number, it's arbitrary, but it works. You tell people a hurricane is coming, they usually take shelter. And likewise, if we declare that a planet is an object orbiting the sun with a diameter of Pluto or bigger, then we can retain all the 9 planets that we grew up with, and we need add only one new planet to the solar system, and that's Eris. But again, Eris is slightly bigger than Pluto, and it does go around the sun. So if you call Pluto a planet, you must call Eris a planet as well. Now, as I mentioned, those astronomers who don't want to regard Pluto as a planet define a planet as something that has cleared out its orbital zone. So nothing substantial should cross its orbit. It should not be part of a belt of objects. And Pluto violates both of those rules because it does cross the orbit of Neptune, and it's part of the Edgeworth-Kuiper belt. So to those astronomers, that's a no-no for Pluto. Pluto is just not important enough to them to be considered a planet.
Mm-hmm. Now, it's also considered to be extremely cold, so most people might think that it's an ice ball or it's a rock, but what exactly is it that we know?
Well, it is very cold, yes indeed. Because Pluto is so very far from the sun, Pluto is a cold world. We don't know the exact temperature, and we won't know the exact temperature until the spacecraft gets to Pluto in 2015. But in round numbers, it's probably about 400 degrees below zero on Pluto. It's 400 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. So it is very cold on Pluto. No question about that, and it's no surprise, therefore, that the surface of Pluto is probably mostly ice, water ice and methane ice. And at that extremely cold temperature, by the way, water ice is as hard as rock. Okay, so that's what Pluto is like on its surface. However, most of the interior of Pluto is rock, and we know this because the density of Pluto is actually quite high. Pluto is denser than any of the giant planets in our solar system, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, or Neptune. And the density tells us that it's made of about 2/3 by mass rock and 1/3 water ice. And we know the density thanks to those moons of Pluto. Those moons are very useful because they feel the gravitational pull of Pluto. And so we can use those moons to establish the mass, the size, and the density of Pluto. And from that we can infer the composition.
Now, was there any chance that there might have been life on Pluto in any way, shape, or form?
I think it's extremely unlikely, simply because it's so incredibly cold. Pluto does have one thing that is good for life, and that's water. It does have water, but it's frozen solid at that temperature. So if you could somehow melt the water on Pluto and keep it liquid, then who knows, maybe. So, if Pluto somehow had some internal heat source, or let's say had a volcano that lasted, somehow managed to last for billions of years, that volcano could keep, let's say, a pool of water liquid, then conceivably you could have some development of life on Pluto. But I really think that's incredibly unlikely. And then on top of that, of course, the sunlight is so faint on Pluto that presumably creatures on Pluto would not make much use of it. Here on Earth, plants use sunlight to engage in photosynthesis. I doubt that would be a terribly attractive possibility to a plant on Pluto. So I would definitely vote Pluto as one of the least likely places in our solar system to find life.
Mm-hmm. Very, very interesting stuff. What were some of the most interesting things you discovered about Pluto as you began to study it?
Well, I've always liked distant things, mysterious things, unexplored things. And so as a kid, I really liked Neptune and Pluto, which were the most distant planets that were known back then. And I like the fact that Pluto crosses Neptune's orbit. I like the fact that they'll never collide with each other. Because they're in this neat 3-to-2 resonance. Every 3 times Neptune goes around the sun, Pluto goes around twice. And whenever they're at the same distance from the sun, they're actually very, very far apart, much farther apart than the Earth and the sun are. So they'll never collide. There's a moon of Neptune that is very similar to Pluto. It's called Triton. And we think that that moon, which is very similar in size, mass, density, composition to Pluto, we think that that moon was once orbiting the sun on its own, going around the sun just as Pluto does, just as Eris does. And then one day, probably many billions of years ago, it passed too close to Neptune, and Neptune grabbed it, and it became a moon. And one reason we think this is because that moon, Triton, is going around Neptune backward, opposite the direction that Neptune spins. And that tells us that the moon probably did not form with Neptune, but is instead a captured object. So those are some of the things that fascinate me about Pluto. But, I mean, the big thing that has always grabbed me about Pluto and also Neptune is just they're so far away, and Pluto is still very, very unexplored and unknown.
Now, is it possible for people who want to gaze into the sky to be able to see Pluto with a regular telescope, or what does it take for us to be able to see Pluto?
Seeing Pluto through a telescope is very difficult because it's so faint. And the reason it's so faint is because it's so far away, not because it's so small. It turns out if you put any of our planets at that distance, at Pluto's mean distance from the sun, you'd need optical aid to see any of them. So the main reason Pluto is so faint is just it's so far from the sun, so the sunlight that's striking it is very weak, and then that sunlight has to travel all the way back to Earth. So that's the main reason Pluto is so faint. But to answer your question, you need a good telescope to see Pluto, and you need a good star map because it looks just like a star. And in fact, this was something that concerned the astronomers back in 1930. When they discovered Pluto, they looked at it through the telescope, and they were expecting to see a disk. You know, if you look at Mars or Jupiter or Saturn through a telescope, it's not a point of light. It's a disk because it's a planet. In the case of Pluto was so distant and so small that it showed no disk. So through a telescope, it's not going to look anything different from a star. And in fact, one of the ways that people confirm that they have found Pluto is simply to mark it on one night, and then on the next night or a few nights later, they'll come back and look again. And if it truly is Pluto that they have seen, then it will have moved. Whereas if it's merely a star, then it will have stayed in the same place.
Oh, boy, I didn't realize, a planet so distant can be so fascinating all at the same time. It's interesting how very little we know about it. What do they hope to, in 2015, you say a craft is going to go by. What are some of the things? Are they going to be able to test, sort of like what we've been doing with Mars?
Yes. We basically want to see what Pluto looks like. And you're absolutely right. Pluto is a fascinating place. That's why I devoted a whole chapter of my book, 10 Worlds, to Pluto. But the spacecraft is going to give us our first impression of Pluto, our first close-up view of Pluto, just as in 1965, the Mariner 4 spacecraft was the first to fly past the planet Mars. Gave us our very first impression of the planet Mars. And it shocked astronomers because it showed a bunch of craters on Mars and showed that Mars was actually looking quite a lot like the moon. In the case of Pluto, we don't know exactly what this spacecraft is going to find. It's going to take high-quality pictures of Pluto and its 3 known moons. It will look for more moons. It will study the atmosphere to some extent. But I think the main thing that I want to see is just what does the surface of Pluto look like? Are there any strange things on the surface of Pluto? Are there going to be craters? Presumably there's going to be some ice on Pluto. Are there going to be maybe ancient volcanoes, or is we just don't know what we're going to see on Pluto. It's terra incognito. We just don't know what it's going to what we're going to see in 2015.
I think what's even interesting too is how long it takes for Pluto to have one orbit around the sun.
Oh yes, Pluto is so very far away that just one orbit around the sun takes 248 years. And Eris, which is this new planet that was discovered in 2005, 3 times farther than Pluto, it takes 559 years to go once around the sun. So, when a planet is that distant from the sun, it takes a long time. Neptune, which is the most distant giant planet in our solar system that's known, goes around the sun once every 165 years. So, these planets, they have very long orbits, and they travel very slowly because they're very far from the sun's gravity. So they they don't really need to move that fast. In contrast, of course, the Earth goes around the sun once a year because it's moving very fast, and it's got a very short orbit.
Fascinating stuff. I want to thank you for being on the program today. Is there a website that people can find out more about your work? Because I know that we've explored a couple of different topics having you on the program. One of them, of course, was Magnificent Universe many years ago, which was a fascinating book, and now you've got this new one, 10 Worlds. How can people find out more about this?
Yeah, my website is kencroswell.com. You can find out about each of my 8 books there, and there's a whole bunch of free astronomy articles that I've written on various topics in astronomy. So if you're curious about astronomy, I recommend you go to kencroswell.com.
Ken Croswell, thank you for joining us on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thank you for having me, Dan.
You bet. So there you go. It's the opportunity to start picking up a really nice hobby or enhancing the one you have when it comes to gazing into the skies. 10 Worlds is the title of the book, and its author is Ken Croswell. Magnificent books, by the way. Very beautiful photographs, just steeped with information so you can find out really good table conversations when it comes to the planets as they come up in conversation. We thank you for joining us here on the program. Be sure to visit us at our website at beyond50radio.com. That's the number 50 with a 50, and sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter where you'll find out more about 10 Worlds as well. Also visit us at our blog where we archive our shows as well as give great resource information for you and others to use as well. We again thank you for listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis, and remember, live your day past halfway.